All right, it is a beautiful day today, early spring, and I'm on the Yeti SB160. Just an incredible enduro race weapon. This thing is really cool. My first Yeti that I've ever been on or reviewed. This bike's got 160 millimeters of rear travel, 170 up front. And based on their marketing materials, basically the enduro race weapon is kind of what they're going for. And it makes sense. This thing just feels really refined to me. Starting off, I love the seated position. It's got a very forward seat position, very steep seat angle, which just feels right these days. And this bike, I certainly feel just super planted while climbing. You don't have to squirm around in the saddle to keep your nose down. You can really just hang out where they put the seat. Just feels super balanced while climbing. And then I'm also incredibly impressed at the anti-squat characteristics of this bike. It's just really props the rear end up while you're pedaling. And yeah, it just feels very supported, doesn't feel sluggish. And when you combine that strong anti-squat with a real forward seat position, you know, this thing just climbs like a beast. This bike also seems to have a very more balanced feeling. Wheelbase, chainstay, reach. Feels like a bit of a longer bike without going totally crazy on the rear chainstay. Yeah, I will say this bike definitely stands out as, in general, uphill, downhill. It's got this feeling of like being on, you feel like you're on top of the bike more than you're inside of the bike. And I think that usually for me comes down to where my feet are at and how high my hands are. I think they got a pretty minimal cockpit up front. And I think if I wanted to feel more sunk into the bike, going to a higher bar might make that feel different. But yeah, while you're climbing, it's a really nice feeling. You really feel like you're in this pretty insane position for mountain goating up stuff. That rear suspension, it just feels like you can gobble stuff up on the climb and descent. And I don't know exactly what's going on back there, but to me, it feels like you've just got this extra point of movement back there. And just really seems like it can take the bite off of hard edges, you know, unlike any system I've ridden. Certainly feels like this bike is just built to gobble stuff up. And looking at that rear suspension, the switch infinity, and you know, it looks like there's a lot going on back there. I was really curious like how much side to side, you know, flex or slop there would be in this bike coming into a corner and sliding the rear end out and whatnot. And that thing feels ridiculously secure for how much is going on back there. Getting excited for the downhill. This thing just really links up with chucking out for some reason. Wow, feels so good clawing up stuff in this bike. Oh my gosh, I'm never able to get that thing. This bike just absolutely leapt up that today. Granted, it's dry, but there's a weird confidence it gave me. Oh man, what a beautiful evening. Just unreal. Feels so good. So, yeah, this thing is really eats the chunk up exceptionally well. These roots, it's just feel like something's just taking the kind of sharp edge off them. Woo. One unique thing about this bike is I do feel like I'm up over the bars quite a bit. One interesting thing about this bike is I definitely feel more like on top of the bike, less like soaked up into it. Wow, yeah, the way it just like handles like square edges and roots and stuff is just so cool. But yeah, I think perhaps it might just be like a short cockpit, but I definitely feel like a little bit more on top of this bike, and I don't feel like my feet are super low, like it's got a super low bottom bracket, which could help you continue to pedal over gnarly terrain. Oh man, I feel like this thing just drives really hard. Just feel like you want to be a bit of a freight train on this bike and just carry momentum. Feeling excellent on the corners tonight, but the dirt is absolutely perfect right now. Yeah, so that Switch Infinity definitely seems to be doing quite a bit. And then, despite what I kind of had imagined, that rear end stays real chunky and solid. You know, it is a single piece rear end. I just kind of imagined with the Switch Infinity that there'd be more playback there, more compliance. But wow, yeah, this thing feels very solid. So the other thing I've noticed about this bike is it's not as poppy in the mid-stroke. You kind of need to get towards the end of the travel, like really preload your weight deep into this bike to get it to pop. Because at first I felt like the bike was a little like dead, like ground hugging more, but it seems like there's a beautiful ramp up at the end of the stroke, which is a sweet way of doing it. Because when you get into that longer travel, I think having a linear, you know, initial part to the travel can really make use of that deep travel more. But anyways, this thing definitely seems to have like a natural tendency to hug the ground, which is interesting. Oh man, it's gonna love this section, I feel like. Yo. Yeah, I'm really like just not getting super beat up through that chunder today. This bike is also one of those bikes that just like really rewards kind of like downhill pedaling where you can sneak it in. You just get that real good support out of the rear end. Oh man, that thing just handled that section so well. It can get just like deep into the travel and feels like just a safe bike to be on. Oh yeah, there we go. Throw a couple pedals and it just feels urgent. Feels so supported back there. It seems like the more aggressive that you ride this bike, the more you kind of can feel like what it's capable of, I suppose. Yeah, it just feels like when you're on the edge and you kind of have those like, oh, I feel like I'm gonna wince moments because things are getting rowdy. That's when something seems to, like right there, something seems to happen a little bit different on this bike. Man, I came in a corner real hot tonight. Locked up that rear. Woo. Yeah, and I am just like throwing that rear end around and it just feels so stable. Another thing is this this bike has been pretty quiet for the most part. I'd say today, with the drier trail conditions, that original Axis derailleur is definitely slapping around back there. But yeah, I feel like they got that chainstay way out of the way, and it just keeps this bike pretty quiet. Yeah, man, it just does something cool to just dampen everything. And with that said, I would not call this like a playful bike at all. This is much more on the full out, like stable, looking for high speed side, freight train that wants to hold its speed. And I think there is like an element, once you feel stable, you start pushing it even harder, and that becomes playful. But I would not say, let's not describe this bike as inherently playful. More of a big, brawling driver. And the way the geometry is, it doesn't have like a super long chainstay, but it does feel like I'm very stable in the rear and a little bit less inclined to like flick that rear end around. Woo. Yeah, that 64-degree head angle just keeps things real calm, especially when you're on like a knife line ridge like that. Another interesting thing with this build is I'm super happy to see a 220mm rotor up front. Oh yeah. I just feel like at my weight, I'm over 200 pounds, and with the code brakes, I can definitely start heating up that front brake, but with the 220, it definitely delays all that heat soak, and just I'm just really glad to see that spec'd on this bike. It definitely deserves it. Yeah, so I feel like this bike just like kind of calms the chaos. It's like really at like the most chaotic moments of trail riding that this thing seems to come into its own the most. Maybe it's just that extra moving piece in the rear end, but certainly seems to do something. I'm here for it. Yeah, so who's this bike for? I'd say this bike is definitely geared towards like the all-out racers. Like, it keeps it cool when things are getting wild and you're plowing through crazy lines with a maxed out heart rate. But also people who just want a super capable, planted feeling bike that is just an insanely comfortable climber, incredibly efficient as far as anti-squat is concerned. Yeah, I'm super impressed by the first Yeti I've ridden. Certainly giving me the zoomies today. So if you like this review, consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. And for the full write-up, head on over to freehubmag.com. Whew, yeah. Oh man.